Well, it's been quite a ride, but after 2 years, the Booster Course Pass DLC for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is finished. And man, would you look at all the content in this game now. I don't even think it's fully registered with me that this game has a whopping 96 tracks, and we thought 48 was a lot. It's funny because I totally believed we just get a Mario Kart 9 during the Switch's life. Not that I made a completely irrelevant video about it or anything, but with this DLC concluded, I think it's time we take a proper look at it and see how things turned out. Without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Kardino. So I know I was joking about how I didn't see any DLC for this game coming, but it seems Nintendo didn't either. Do you remember how casually they announced this? We're just about to wrap up a direct, and then they just come out and say,
"Here's some news for Mario Kart fans."
It was clear that this announcement was supposed to garner hype, but I think it more so sparked confusion. I mean, it was clear to see that these would just be tour courses ported to the main game. The real question, though, was just how much effort they would put into them. But if the trailer was any indication, the answer was not much. Still though, it was a bit before this wave was released, and anyway, you can't not getting 48 new courses. At that point, it's basically Mario Kart 9. Well, let's go through each wave to see how they delivered. Oh, but I'd better preface, I'm going to be pretty harsh at points, but that's because I'm mostly comparing these to the quality of the base game. It's important to keep in context that at the end of the day, it's Mario Kart, and I'll still have a good time. So my criticisms come from having high standards for the series. Got it? Alright. Wave 1 released on March 18th, and yeah, it wasn't great. Okay, to be fair, it wasn't all bad. In fact, I'd say half the courses were overall decent. The other half, though, yeah, not so decent. So let's jump right into it. Tour Paris Promenade is pretty much a standard city course, though I guess I should probably elaborate on what that means. The main appeal of these is that you're racing on what people envision when they think of that location. So for Paris, you'll see some nice architecture, including, of course, the Eiffel Tower. The track layout is overall pretty simple, with easy turns making up the majority of what you'll be dealing with. That's fair though, since this is the first track in the DLC. I like how you race in the reverse direction on the last lap too. It's a neat gimmick that gives things a good change of pace. Though, as we'll see on all tour ports, they had to make the roads wider to adjust for 12 people at a time instead of just 8. And instead of editing the actual map, they chose to scale everything up. So that means the surrounding scenery is abnormally big. It seems like such a weird problem to have. 3DS Toad Circuit doesn't have this problem, but it does suffer from two others, having the most basic textures ever, and being 3DS Toad Circuit. So I know the original version had this basic flat texture for the grass and the sand, but wasn't the point of bringing it over to 8 partially to make it look better with the Switch's graphical prowess? Even looking past that, why 3DS Toad Circuit? At that point they might as well have chosen DS Figure 8 Circuit. It's not that far off layout wise. I know the first couple cups are supposed to be simpler and it was already in Tour, but jeez. They added nothing of interest here, and as far as ports go, it feels like a careless copy-paste job. I just don't get why they did such poor texture work when we already had good textures in the base game. I don't know how this game works behind the scenes, but was it that complicated of a job? At least we have N64 Choco Mountain next. And even though this remake came from Tour, I can at least say that the scaling of everything up isn't too distracting here. I like the cave they added where a simple tunnel used to be, and the bats flying out were a nice touch. It's not an amazing job by any means. If this were in the base game, I can only imagine how much more they would have done, especially with the visuals. But for what it's worth, this was a good pick. Rounding out the first cup, we have Wii Coconut Mall. Now, unpopular opinion here, I always thought this map was a little overrated. Not to say it's bad, but I think when you place it next to the rest of Wii's lineup, there are some tracks that deserved a port more. Still, it's alright, though I don't know what they were thinking with these golden floors. They look way worse than the original white ones. And yeah, I'm kind of obligated to mention that even after the update, they kinda ruined the parking lot section. Whereas before you had to dodge and weave your way to the finish line, now you just slightly swerve to either side. Alright, time to discuss Tour Tokyo Blur. As someone who has played Tour off and on from its launch, there is a consistent problem I noticed, especially in the beginning. Most of the original tracks were very boring. And that goes for Tokyo Blur. There's just not much going on. Sure, there are some landmarks you pass by, but in general, I feel like if they were going to depict Tokyo, they should have gone for the futuristic feel like everyone else. There's this part on the third lap where you enter a freeway, and then it just abruptly ends with a glide ramp? Where'd the rest of the freeway go? I thought they were going for a more realistic take on Tokyo, but I guess they couldn't figure out how to get a freeway to loop back or something. And then it has the same problem as the Paris track when it comes to just upscaling everything. So not only is it boring to play, it's not the best to look at either, which is a good sign that a course has failed if you ask me. But alright, next up is DS Shroom Ridge. I am an avid defender of this track. Sure, as a kid I didn't think much of it, but recently I've gained an appreciation for the more scenic feeling tracks. I love the view over the cliff, the cars that make you stay alert, and the overall track layout. It's just a shame the basic textures are still here. Though I will say, out of all the tracks obviously designed for Tour, this one has no scaling issues from what I can tell. They even added a glider ramp in the middle and a shortcut near the end. Like Choco Mountain, I can say this was a net positive addition. Following that track is GBA Sky Garden, if you could even call it that anymore. Jeez, did they simplify the track design. This had a near simultaneous release with Tour, and I suspect they wanted to shorten the track a bit. That, or they wanted to make it easier. Either way, as someone who only played the DS remake, I wasn't appalled by this change or anything, but I can definitely tell it's a downgrade and see how some people got upset. In fact, the simplified layout makes this track a little forgettable now, to be honest. It's a shame too, considering how good this new remix is. Last in this wave is Ninja Hideaway, which did actually come from Tour, though for some reason they didn't mark it as such. I love the theme. I mean, how could I not? Taking the alternate routes and making those sharp turns makes this course the arguable standout of all the additions here. You could argue it's not intuitively designed as a race course, and I wouldn't entirely disagree, but it's not atrocious. A few scaling issues emerge here too, albeit ones that are less blatant than the city tracks. Though I will say, this is one of the worst ones to play on 200cc. It's almost unfair. But with that being said, Wave 1 was very divisive when it was released. When it first dropped, the cars didn't even move in Coconut Mall, and it was very clear that the two cups were rushed overall. We were going from amazing remakes in the base game to tracks that looked like they were from the 3DS. Which makes sense considering they were all made for Tour. There was debate on how bad these ports really were, but I will say it was the first new Grand Prix content we'd gotten in 5 to 8 years. Many of us would take just about anything at the time. Still, it's much easier to see how low effort this was, now that we have some higher quality content. Speaking of which, let's move on. Wave 2 released on August 4th, roughly 4 months after the first. The response this time was actually somewhat more positive, and I think this had a lot to do with the course selection. I mean, outside of the first two, there's really nothing to straight up dislike. Speaking of, Tour New York Minute was the first course added to the app, and you can tell. It takes place at night, which is at least a little different, but jeez, there's not much else to say. The buildings all have the same basic yellow light shining out of the windows, and all of them are a perfect square. But I think the main problem is that it just feels like you don't really do much until the very end. You go along a small park path a couple times, and then there's some streets to race on, but compare this to any of the base tracks, and you can see the difference immediately. Of course, I'd be lying if I said nothing happened at all. You do go into some sort of hallway and parking garage. That's pretty fun. Why didn't they do more of that? Racing through buildings is a lot more interesting than just going around them. Even then, Neo Bowser City was way better in every aspect. Sure, it's not the most realistic track in the world, but does New York Minute really have anyone defending it on the basis of realism? SNES Mario Circuit 3 was next, and I think everyone was collectively baffled. Take the SNES remakes from the base game, then compare them to what we have here. It looks like the DS retro tracks. Now, it is true that it's pretty challenging on 200cc, and I'd argue that's the definitive way to play the course, but overall, it just feels like filler. And on Wave 2, that doesn't bode well. Once again, the graphics are that same basic style as Toad Circuit, and there's no elevation changes at all. Even the music just sounds like the Wii remake, just slightly bass boosted. It's definitely one of those tracks you forget was included, and there really isn't much to say about it at all. So let's move on. N64 Calamari Desert was the first legacy course that I saw people actually get excited over. And that's because it's probably the first DLC track that actually feels like more than the minimum effort was put in. The lighting looks pretty good, and of course the changes to the track are a great unexpected twist, at least anyone who hasn't played Tour. During lap 2, you actually divert from the main path and instead do a circuit of the train track itself. And that ensures you'll be needing to dodge a head-on collision with the train at least twice. It's such a simple but great change that really makes you feel like you're playing the course in a whole new way. Granted, the textures are still incredibly basic, which is still a little saddening. I mean, they even had desert textures in the base game. So it does still feel a little cheap. But at this point, most people were willing to take it on the chin if it meant they were gonna remix some of these courses too. But of course, that wasn't the only track that got everyone excited for this wave. That would be DS Waluigi Pinball. Some might say this track is overrated, but I disagree. On the DS, it was legendary. This version, though, I feel had some seriously missed potential. The thing about remakes like these is that since Tour was based off of 7, most of its retro tracks came from 7 too. But while Calamari Desert was a flat and boring track until the remake, Waluigi Pinball had some serious potential, and the 7 remake did nothing with it. Now, in Mario Kart 8, you'd expect there to be anti-gravity for half the track, but nope, it's basically unchanged. Sure, the textures have been touched up, it actually looks pretty good, but I just feel somewhat underwhelmed when playing this version, which sounds like a stupid argument, but I've just gotta be true to my opinions here. Outside of the actual pinball table, a single jump, and an auto glider section, you're basically just driving on an angled road and occasionally avoiding a pinball. You could have at least twisted the track to make it anti-gravity, maybe added some pinball-themed obstacles. It's such a shame, this track deserved better. On to the next cup, starting with Tour Sydney Sprint. Up to this point, this was easily the best city track. Now, being uncultured, I don't really know much about foreign cities, so I couldn't tell you how faithful these courses are to their real-world counterparts. But I love the giant amusement park you race around, and that oceanside view. The Opera House is a little interesting, but it's like the New York building where you're in it for maybe 3 seconds. And yikes. I'm not gonna mention it every time, but those audience members are pretty distracting once you notice them. The real highlight here, though, is the music. It's almost on the same level as Dolphin Shoals with just how much the sax demands your respect. Is it the best course in the wave? No, but it's much better than New York Minute or Mario Circuit 3, that's for sure. I view GBA Snowland similar to how I view DS Shroom Ridge. Is it anything amazing? No, but I appreciate it for its simplicity. It's just a good snow track. What's more, this is a remake with some real effort put into it. Yeah, it's from Tour, but the scaling feels fine here, the music is upbeat, and I basically have no complaints. In fact, this might be one of the only instances where I don't have much to say purely because of its perfect simplicity. I definitely played this before Ice Ice Outpost. Alright, let's talk about Wii Mushroom Gorge. And here's an opinion that might surprise you. This track is good, but by that point, it wasn't as exciting as it could have been. On Wii, it was the first course to heavily feature the trick system. On top of that, it was just a solidly designed track. But I don't know if I'd label Mushroom Gorge as a classic, especially when there's a course in the exact same cup that would have been better. And of course, I know why it ended up here. It was a remake in 7 before being ported to Tour, and subsequently the Booster Course Pass. But consider this, why did they put it here when you have at least 2 courses of about the same difficulty that are decidedly worse? It sounds like a dumb argument at first glance, but you could have easily dropped 3DS Toad Circuit or SNES Mario Circuit 3 for this one, and the game would be better off for it. Then we could have gone something more fun like DS Airship Fortress or GCN Dino Dino Jungle, both of which were in Tour by this point. So I guess my problem is not that the track is in the DLC, but that we're in the 4th cup playing a beginner track. Judging the course in a vacuum, it's a perfectly fine port. I just can't bring myself to care that much. Rounding out this pack is Sky High Sunday. The biggest selling point on this one was that it was the first time this DLC used anti-gravity, and honestly, I didn't even notice. I know this course definitely has its fans, but to me the design just doesn't do anything interesting. You're basically just driving in an oval while doing a bunch of tricks, which Excite Bike Arena already did. And while I do like how you can spin off these rails, you'd think they'd want to make the course a bit more challenging and make them an obstacle. As for the theming, it's pretty cool, but it was already done in the base game with a much more interesting design. But is it really much of a surprise? It came out almost at the same time in Tour, so it was clearly made to fit that game's difficulty. That's really my biggest issue with this wave. Some of these courses feel like they would have fit in the Mushroom or maybe Flower Cup. But not only are these placed in the same difficulty brackets as the Star and Special Cups, but anyone who's playing this DLC will have most likely beaten all the most challenging tracks before. Let's not forget that this game is almost 10 years old by this point. Of course, that doesn't mean I think these cups are bad at the end of the day, but I kind of view it as a better Wave 1. It's still not on par with the base game, but it was at least a step in the right direction, which, as long as you take that second step, that's okay. But the question is, would they? Wave 3 released on December 7th, making this somewhat of a holiday release. And you know what? I think the developers really brought their A game. The track selection alone is way more interesting this time, including my personal favorite of the entire series. But before I get to enjoy my dessert, I guess I have to eat my vegetables first. Okay, admittedly, Tour London Loop is pretty good as far as vegetable courses go. The layout is better than, say, Tokyo Blur or New York Minute. I like the chain chomps that eventually break free in the last lap, and the fog is pretty atmospheric too. But it's still a vegetable at the end of the day. As fun as taking different routes is, I don't feel like these ones make that much of a difference. Plus, I think they come up somewhat suddenly. So while it does feel like you're driving through a city, there are only a few really good highlights. It overall mostly feels like just another city track. Again though, we've definitely had worse, and as much as I'd like to joke that you can't spell this track without 2 capital L's, I'd rather play it over at least 2 other city tracks, so good for it. Alright, it's basically all uphill from here, so let's make like Sisyphus and get this boulder rolling with GBA Boo Lake. Well, first off, let's give it the obligatory points for being a pretty good remake of an older track, and including anti-gravity sections to boot. I like the hairpin turn here, immediately followed by a risky shortcut. And by the way, the graphics look really good this time. I appreciate the extra touches like the wet floorboards near the edge, the bonefish swimming around, and that full moon reflection on the water. Finally, we're getting near base game quality. My only complaint is that the track feels a little short, but I'd rather have an interesting layout over a longer one any day. This is another one of those courses where I could try to talk about it more, but it's good enough that I think I've said everything really worth saying in less than a minute. Good job to the dev team. Hey, it looks like my Sisyphus analogy is carrying me farther than I expected, because next up is 3DS Rock Mountain. I feel like I'm in the minority when I say I really like this one. Let me be real here. I think Mario Kart 7 was a bit of a step back from Wii or even DS. Out of the 16 new tracks, I only think about 7 are really worth mentioning in the context of the series, but one of those just so happens to be Rock Mountain. It has the same feeling as Shroom Ridge, where it doesn't do anything particularly exceptional, it doesn't have gimmicks, it doesn't have flashy theming or even a complex design. But it has a scenic atmosphere, a few things to keep you on your toes, and there's very little to complain about in my opinion. As for the port, it's nothing to write home about. The forest especially looks similar to, well, Shroom Ridge. But it's nothing deal-breaking. It's a serviceable version of a solid track. One might even say it's rock solid. I'm not apologizing. Wii Maple Treeway is back, and almost as good as ever. What's funny is, as a kid, I didn't really think this course did anything remarkable, but over the years, it's gained more and more of my respect. I still don't think it's one of the best tracks in the series, or even in Wii, but it's far from featureless. And yeah, the half-pipe system is somewhat shoehorned into the engine, but using the half-pipes is almost always slower anyway, so I can live with it. Again, with it being a remake from the Wii, it's not like they had to do too much to update it. It's a solid way to end the Rock Cup. Wow, the mileage on this analogy is insane. Sadly, we're stumbling a bit with Tour Berlin Byways, which has very memorable music, and not much else. I feel like I'm gonna run out of things to say about these city courses soon, and we're not even halfway through. I guess this one has a different feel than the others. For one, there's traffic on the road, and the different paths really take you all over the place. You'll be going through a train station, taking a side road through a park, and passing the Berlin Wall. For what it's worth, this track is not unenjoyable, but I don't really find it memorable at all. I had to play back my recorded footage just to come up with this much. Otherwise, it's just a blur of driving down a few streets and following the red arrows. Well, at least we have DS Peach Gardens coming up next. Personally, I never thought this course was anything special, but I recognize that a lot of people do. It's definitely relaxing, that's for sure. There's plenty of small shortcuts to take, and more open areas that are perfect to use items in. And of course I have to mention how great it is when you realize the third lap consists of going the opposite direction with an added glider ramp. I wouldn't call this track a highlight, but I enjoy it more than most of the stuff in previous waves. Merry Mountain feels like you're at a Disneyland attraction. There's so much stuff going on in the scenery, like the beautiful mountaintop view, the humongous pile of presents, and the numerous flying sleighs and trains. The visuals are a true standout from this DLC. My biggest issue is that the track itself is not very interesting to drive on. Sure, you have an anti-gravity section and this split path that lasts a few seconds, but that's basically it. At the end of the day, you're going in a giant oval. Wait, didn't I make the same complaint about Sky High Sunday? Well, I guess I'll chalk it up to Tour Syndrome. But you know what? I don't even care that much. Because you know what comes after this course? 3DS Rainbow Road is my favorite Mario Kart track of all time. And I've made that clear from the dawn of my channel. That's a bad video though, you probably shouldn't watch it. It's not a controversial take by any means, but there's good reasons for it. In my opinion, there are two components that a Mario Kart track has to have: spectacle and interesting track design. And honestly, the only other Rainbow Road I think comes close to that is Wii, with an argument being possible for Double Dash. This track takes the space theme and runs with it. No, it doesn't just run with it, it soars. Racing around the planets, falling onto the moon, and gliding past asteroids makes this track a treat for the eyes and a fun challenge as a track. That's not to mention driving on Saturn's rings and tricking off the waves the road makes. And can I just take a moment to say that this is probably the best looking track of all the DLC? It's like it was pulled right out of the base game. I love the translucent look they gave to the road itself, and that space background with the sun in the distance. Amazing. That remix is very well done too. While I would have loved to hear a more dreamy take, similar to the original, the new approach they took fits almost as well. So yes, Wave 3 was, without a doubt, the best one they released so far. As someone who didn't really mind the drop in quality at first, this wave shut my mouth real quick. Who in their right mind is gonna bypass Maple Treeway and Rainbow Road for Toad Circuit and Sky Garden? Nobody. The answer is nobody. And you know what? I'll say it. I'll play at least half of these tracks before I pick Coconut Mall. The only time you are gonna pick Wave 1 at this point is if you'd already played most of Wave 3 and probably at least half of the tracks from Wave 2. Up until now, a lot of people, including me, were basically of the opinion that yes, the tracks were of a poor quality than before, but it had been so long since we got new tracks that we could enjoy it for what it was. Now, we were on a whole other level of quality. And just when we thought it couldn't get any better, there was also a free simultaneous update to add custom items and races. Nobody expected it, but everybody appreciated it. I said at the end of Wave 2 that taking a step in the right direction is perfectly fine, as long as you take a second step after it. And I don't think there's any doubt that they did just that, despite the rough textures at points. Bravo, dev team. Bravo. Wave 4 released on March 9th, 2023, and with it came not only 8 new courses, but a new character as well. Birdo was added along with all the normal color variations, and a lot of people were ecstatic. I will say that Mario Kart 8 made some strange choices with its roster, so seeing them retroactively add fan-requested picks was pretty nice. That being said, I'm the type of guy who will either pick Mario or Yoshi every time I play, so new characters were basically just an extra bonus. Anyway, it's time to talk about the stuff I actually care about, the new tracks. Can we go back to talking about characters? Tour Amsterdam Drift is our opening city track this time, and it is slightly worse than most of the others. It's not bad in the same way as Tokyo Blur, because that track suffers mostly from a boring track layout. Amsterdam almost feels too chaotic at points. The main city area has so many twists and turns that overlap each other that it's hard to keep track. You'll be following the arrows and realize that you're now driving through an intersection with the previous lap's route. The harbor area offers a different challenge, featuring several right turns. The best parts are at the beginning and the end, when you aren't actually in the city, but the areas around it. They're a welcome break from all the action. Again, I don't think this one is the worst city track here. It's got some teeth to it as far as difficulty is concerned, and it leaves more of an impact than New York, or, again, Tokyo. I'd actually put it just below Paris, as weird as that is to say. GBA Riverside Park is a pretty good remake, though I'd probably pick Snowland or Boo Lake over it. The thing about all these GBA tracks is that they're all pretty short, meaning they don't get to do as much interesting stuff as the console entries. So they either have to offer really good track designs or memorable atmospheres. Riverside Park offers decent levels of both, but nothing spectacular. Don't let that convince you there's nothing good about this course though. The sunset is nice, the piranha plants are unique, and the cave leading up to the jump through a waterfall is pretty fun. I just wish that last part in particular lasted a bit longer. Either way, I'm not at all upset that this port is here. It's just one of those tracks that won't convince me to pick a cup, but is fun enough when I'm playing it. Wii DK Summit is yet another classic that was a no-brainer to bring over. In fact, the only reason I'm sure 8 didn't have it originally was because it didn't have a half-pipe trick system. Well, that and Mount Wario just showing it up in basically every way. In that sense, you could say that they could have chosen better, but let's be real, it's a classic course, and it still holds up despite the new engine. It's kind of a mixed bag because on one hand, you have this great course returning that was one of the strongest picks from its source game. On the other, the port is a little shaky and it's overshadowed by a newer version of itself in a lot of aspects. So again, I'd say it's a net positive to the DLC, but there's an asterisk attached. Yoshi's Island was a second new course in the Booster Course Pass, and it's much, much better than Sky High Sundae if you ask me. The little touches they made, like changing the regular coins into Yoshi coins and changing the fanfares, really tie it all together. As much as it pains me to say it though, it does suffer a bit from tour syndrome. It's very short and not really difficult. Nonetheless, the sheer amount of references hidden all over the background, combined with the modernized art style, makes it hard to really complain about it at all. I can't say the same about Tour Bangkok Rush, that's for sure. Nothing really happens in this one. Sure, you start out in the area with shallow water, and later on you go up a parking tower, but you're in both of those places for probably less than 10 seconds. The rest of the course is pretty much just driving down a few roads, maybe taking a higher path, which isn't even faster in my experience, and gliding past this statue. It's better than Amsterdam, but it's probably the most middle-of-the-road city track so far. Even the sunset won't help it much because, at this point, we've seen that before in this DLC. The thing is, these courses aren't bad necessarily, it's just that you play them so that you can play the more interesting stuff later in the cup. Nobody's gonna be breaking out the Switch this Christmas in order to play some Bangkok Rush. At least we've got another good track incoming, DS Mario Circuit. This fits right in there with Shroom Ridge and Rock Mountain. Yeah, the textures are a bit lacking. There's only so many times I can overlook them using the solid green texture for grass and trees. But the track layout is solid. I like the section with the fire-breathing piranha plants, and immediately after that comes a shady forest with a wiggler. The layout also has a bit of challenge to it, as opposed to a certain other circuit I could mention. It's a solid time, which I just wish looked a little better than it already does. GCN Waluigi Stadium is a stunning upgrade. I think it's clear that this is where a lot of dev time went. It has basically everything you could ask for in a remake. None of the layout is compromised, they added anti-gravity sections, you've got half pipes, the whole enchilada. It all comes together to turn what I thought was a pretty forgettable track in Double Dash to one of this wave's 3 big highlights. Of course, I could say that Wario Coliseum would have been the better Double Dash track to bring over, and I just did. But I know why, it's because it wasn't in Tour. So I guess I'll just take what I can get. Tour Singapore Speedway is the 3rd city track in this wave. But it's actually good? Yeah, apparently they know when they have something special on their hands, because this is easily the best way they could have closed out the cup, given the selection. In fact, having played this before, I was anticipating this one. This is a city track done right. The roads aren't too narrow, the night sky sets a nice atmosphere, the music is amazing, and of course, there's plenty of interesting stuff going on. You fly onto a rooftop pool, you trick off colored geysers, you follow a bridge weaving through the skyscrapers, and much more. The track is not the most challenging in the world, and the graphics are still nothing special, but you know what? I don't think many people cared at this point. The problem with Waves 1 and 2 is that most of the tracks weren't particularly interesting, so the simple textures stood out more. Now, while you can definitely see the difference when comparing this track to one from the base game, you're so caught up in the excitement of the moment that you don't really notice. So with that said, how does Wave 4 compare to the first 3? Well, it was better than 1 and 2, that's for sure. I think the track selection was better in 3 though. It probably comes down to a personal preference, but I did find myself getting excited more for Boo Lake, Maple Treeway, and Rainbow Road. Whereas for Riverside Park, DK Summit, and Waluigi Stadium, I more so thought, yeah, those are pretty good tracks to bring over. Of course, Yoshi's Island was the big selling point here, along with Birdo, and I can't deny they were good additions. But I just find myself wanting to play the Wave 3 Cups a bit more. So it wasn't really a step forward, but it wasn't a step back either. Wave 5 released on July 12th, bringing with it not 1, not 2, but 3 additional characters, PD Piranha, Wiggler, and Kamek. Alright, who was asking for these 2? Kamek I can understand, but the others are just meme characters. Not that Mario Kart 8 doesn't already have a handful of them. Regardless, they're here now, along with the 8 new tracks, so let's get going, shall we? Tour Athens Dash is a really cool concept that stands out from the rest of the city tracks. I love driving through the ancient ruins, gliding through the houses, and dodging the rolling rocks. The atmosphere is amazing, but that isn't to say it's flawless. I feel like the general track design is on the weaker end of things. While I respect difficulty, it's sometimes hard to tell which direction you're supposed to go in the short time you have. It's especially bad when you're climbing a slope because the camera's too close to the ground to see what's over the top. And of course, like the other tour tracks, the texture and geometry work is almost distractingly simple. They did include half-pipe jumps, but they honestly feel kind of unnecessary. At any rate, I'm never inclined to use them, unless I'm going too fast in 200cc. It's for these reasons that I'd say Athens is very average among its brethren. I guess by this point I'm ranking them, so I'd put it just below Paris. It's time for GCN Daisy Cruiser. A fan favorite from Double Dash, this is the Mario Kart 7 port, with no extra bells or whistles. And you know what? There's really nothing substantial to complain about here. But don't worry, I'll find a way. I guess if I had to nitpick, it's that the beginning section was made a little easier. Now that you can just drive through water, the pool is no longer an obstacle. Again, it's a problem that mostly carries over from 7. Also, I think the aesthetic when you enter the lower deck is a little too bright. I like the change in atmosphere between the sunny deck and the darker cabin, especially when you fell into the cargo hold, which, by the way, was flooded in 7 for no real reason and is once again flooded here. See? I knew I could do it. But I will emphasize again that these complaints are so minor that if I foresaw myself talking about this course again, I'd probably not even mention them. But anyway, yeah, this was a winner with an absolutely beautiful soundtrack remake. Wii Moonview Highway is another top 10 track for me. It just sets a frantic pace which I feel is kinda unique, outside of maybe Mushroom City. Though this time, the cars are much less of an obstacle. In Wii, they were an actual threat. It was a Special Cup course after all. But here, it's barely more challenging than Shroom Ridge. I actually looked this up on the Mario Wiki when I first suspected it, and yeah, not only do the cars move slower, not even speeding up in the city, but their number was significantly reduced. And this track really needs a frantic feel, because otherwise, the layout isn't anything mind-blowing. It's a giant circle for the most part. I don't know, maybe it's all in my head, but I do feel like something is missing here. Squeaky Clean Sprint is the third new course, and I'll admit, I was initially kinda mixed on this one. I mean, of all the rooms in the house to recreate, why a bathroom? I understand it's Mario's natural habitat, but why not the kitchen or the living room? There were tons of possibilities. I mean, they already proved that with GBA Ribbon Road. The bathroom was just kind of a weird choice, and I feel like the team was aware of this. After all, it's not just any bathroom, guys. It's a squeaky clean bathroom. Well, at the very least, I can't say they didn't let their imaginations run wild. Using bath bombs to perform tricks, driving on sponges, and being blown by a fan were creative ideas. And I can say that I would never have thought of Mario and friends driving down the bathtub drain before gliding through a geyser of toilet water. Squeaky clean toilet water, remember? Regardless, now that I've described a premise I'd never thought I would, let's move on to the actual track design, which is actually quite good. There's some alternate paths, a few shortcuts, and the aforementioned soapy counter with the fan. And that music surprisingly fits perfectly. A small bit of tour syndrome overall, but it's grown to be my favorite of the 3 new tracks. And on that somewhat positive note, let's talk about Tour Los Angeles Laps. This one has one of the better layouts for the most part, and as far as city tracks go, it's okay. Well, that is except this section. It's so one-note and straightforward, it feels almost like a waste of a lap. Plus, once again, it's not helped by the very simple textures. And let me just say, I'm sorry to whoever had to adapt this song for 8 Deluxe. The song by itself is nothing that special when you first listen to it, but when you compare it to the original, imagine you're just some guy at Nintendo and your boss tells you to rework this. Okay, if I'm being honest, I've heard worse. But I think it's safe to say this is one of, if not the worst song in the series. Back to the port though, it's nothing amazing, but I'd probably put it below Sydney Sprint, which at least puts it in the top 5. If you want a real disappointment though, let's talk about GBA Sunset Wilds. The biggest problem this track faced was that there was only one real thing going for it, the sunset. Because otherwise, it was just kind of a boring track with nothing much going on besides this Shy Guy camp. Even in the remake, they added a couple hills, and that's about it. So when you port that track into an engine with baked lighting so that you can't make the sun set between laps, what you get? A pointless port, that's what. At least in Tour, the sun still set during the last lap, so it had a reason to exist. Come on, 8, you're getting beaten by Tour. And the crazy thing is, it's not like they were starved for GBA ports to bring over either. Peach Circuit, Cheap Island, or Lakeside Park would have all been better options. I don't think we've seen a pick this disappointing since Wave 2. Well, where that course failed, Wii Koopa Cape is there to add more content? Another one of my top 10 favorites. I was really excited and a little nervous at the same time when I saw this one in the trailer. Because while I loved the original, 7 kinda ruined the challenge. And it turns out my fears were founded because, for the most part, it's the version from 7 again. They did add the trick ramps back to soften the blow, but this is still undeniably a downgrade. As a refresher, the original offered several risk-reward situations. You could either drive down this river to go faster, or you could keep to the slower route but have more control. You could take the current in the pipe to speed ahead, but if you got hit by an electric bar, you'd be at a big disadvantage. You could risk a shortcut with this waterfall before the finish line, possibly snagging a last-second victory, but if you failed, your goose was basically cooked. So what did 7 do? It added a glider ramp so you could skip most of the river, it completely flooded the pipe, and removed the electric bars with only Cheeps to replace them. The only thing really left intact was the waterfall at the end. Again, the port this time around added back the half-pipe ramps and added anti-gravity bumpers to the pipe, plus they removed the glider ramp over the river. So the course is only half ruined now. At least they didn't add any new problems, and the atmosphere is still intact. Plus the underwater remix is very nice. But the Wii version will always be the best in my eyes. Tour Vancouver Velocity finished things up this time, and I feel like it was supposed to be another Singapore Speedway situation. It wasn't. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely the best of the city tracks in this wave, and the first lap starts things off with a bang. But I feel like it kinda runs out of steam after that. You go through this ice rink a couple times, but if you don't know the track layout, good luck finding the exit in time. Beyond that, there isn't much to remember here. I like how it takes place at night, I like the music, and I like the snow-covered forest and trip through the park. But beyond that, it felt just like any other city. It gets points for at least offering a bit more of a challenge. Overall, I'd have to put this course above Sydney, but do I think it was big enough to finish the wave? It's teetering on the edge for me. Wow, that second cup was pretty rough. Leaving Wave 5, I think it's fair to say I wanted a bit more. The Feather Cup was pretty good, but after that first punch, I was expecting a follow-up. But instead, I got a tap on the cheek. Koopa Cape and Vancouver were alright, but with their various problems, they couldn't make up for the 2 tracks preceding them, especially Sunset Wilds. We did get additional characters, but again, I barely factor that in since I'm really just here for the new courses. We aren't back to Wave 2 levels, but I will say Wave 5 on the whole felt like a half step back. But it wasn't all bad. They had one last shot before the DLC wrapped up. I could only hope they would deliver something on par with Wave 3. So, did my wish come true? Wave 6 released on November 9th, this time including 4 characters: Funky Kong, Diddy Kong, Pauline, and Peachette. A bit weird with that last pick, but next to Wiggler and Pink Gold Peach, she fits in, I guess. Regardless, that brings the new character count up to 8, and I think by this point, there aren't any obvious omissions. They even added a bunch of new Mii costumes, for those people who play as their Mii in Mario Kart 8. Anyway, let's move on to the good stuff. The final 2 cups. Tour Rome Avanti is definitely one of the better city tracks. In fact, it actually reminds me of an improved Athens Dash or Amsterdam Drift. I say that because it once again revolves around taking different routes centered around this town square. You'll be intersecting with lower ranked players surprisingly often. Plus, aside from one particularly awkward turn, there's some good track design here. I'm especially a fan of the parts where you enter the Coliseum, both on the bleachers and in the center with the chain chomps. This one is just below Vancouver Velocity. GCN DK Mountain hails once again after its last console appearance on Wii. I was actually pretty surprised to realize there were only 3 Double Dash tracks brought over. I don't know whether I would have preferred Dino Dino Jungle or not, but it's better than Mushroom Bridge, that's for sure. Like in Wii, they did widen the track, meaning the hairpin turns at the end aren't nearly as difficult, but besides that and the usual graphical simplicity, I don't have many real complaints. Tricking off the mountain is fun as expected, and I like how they made the tilting bridge wavy. It was a good track originally, and it's a good track here, only a bit easier. Wii Daisy Circuit was an odd pick, to say the least. I was pretty neutral on it in the original. Still though, it was a choice between this and Dry Dry Ruins, and I don't know which one would have been better. On one hand, this is the normal track of the wave, but on the other hand, it would have been nice to have a difficult desert track in the game that wasn't Bone Dry Dunes. Regardless, the glow-up is immediately apparent. Instead of the extremely yellow-orange look of the original, this looks more like an actual sunset. Like its source, it doesn't do much fancy, but as far as circuit tracks go, you could do worse. Piranha Plant Cove is another tour track, and it's perfectly fine. And I mean that, it doesn't do anything wrong really. It's just a little forgettable. I like the nighttime aesthetic, but that's not unique. The theming is interesting, being some kind of submerged ruin, and it grew on me, so to speak. The strongest aspect is the track design. It has a good mixture of parts above and below the water, and the enemies help keep your attention on the road. There's even some background sea life, which adds to the atmosphere. In terms of the original tour tracks, I prefer Squeaky Clean Sprint, but I'd probably take it over Yoshi's Island. Tour Madrid Drive is next, bringing an end to the amount of times they have to come up with something to say about these things. Okay, to be fair, some of the music is good here. Sure, there's a version with a very obvious fake choir, not sure what happened after Amsterdam, but the version with the Spanish guitar is great. Not only that, but the visuals actually look, well, I was gonna say okay, but it's like a weird mixture. There are some clearly low quality assets being used. But the stuff on the actual street looks good, and when you're playing the game, it's mostly ignorable. What this course excels at is its varied locations. Even the market square has a wiggler that wakes up on the second lap. Going through the museum and the soccer field shook things up. I like how the Goombas are wearing the shoes from Mario 3 and how the crowd cheers when you go through the goal. So while not the strongest ending to the series, it's closer to the upper end than the other. Right above Sydney's Sprint, I think. Alright, with the last city behind us, it's time for 3DS Rosalina's Ice World. Once again, I know a lot of people like this one in 7, but I didn't think it was particularly special. We've seen better ice courses, and as much as I like Galaxy, that didn't make up for what I felt was a somewhat dull experience. So like with Daisy Circuit, I was somewhat lukewarm. And also like Daisy Circuit, I enjoyed it more than I expected. Even though it isn't anything crazy, the graphical upgrade let the aesthetics of the course shine much brighter than they did before. And that remix? It made me pay attention to the song for the first time. There are also small additions, but I like the new shortcut at the end and how you can drive up into the snow in the beginning section. I don't know why I was so pleasantly surprised by that. So again, this course gets a pass. It's kinda weird to think that SNES Bowser Castle 3 is only the second one of its series in all of 8. And you know what? It's just about as good as I'd expect from a SNES remix. A lot of it's in anti-gravity, there's plenty of places to fall off, and while the graphics aren't jaw-dropping, this is a huge step up from any of the GBA or SNES Bowser Castle remakes up until now. There are moments when you can easily forget where this course actually came from. And you know what? Honestly, there isn't much else to say. It's just good. But finally, we come to Wii Rainbow Road, the only one that can give 3DS a run for its money. By the way, I mentioned just now there are only 2 Bowser Castles in the game, but now there's 5 Rainbow Roads. And in a way, there's now one that covers every level of intensity. But let's just get the negatives out of the way, shall we? Well, the primary issue is that the course was clearly designed for Wii's engine. The camera worked better with the half pipes, you seemingly built more speed, and steering was a bit more difficult, at least as a motorcycle user. Here, the track seems a bit easier than before. Also, I kinda prefer the transparent floor from 7 instead of the tiled look of the other versions. Super nitpicky, but that's because those are really all the problems I can think of. We knew this course was coming even before it was announced, and everyone was ready. And it seems that excitement carried over to the developers. The skybox is full of detail, the remix is great, and they even added a small reference if you fall off the track. In the original, you'd fall down in flames, and here, you actually do the same thing for a brief second before Lakitu saves you. You know when they do things like that, they know they're making a crowd pleaser. What a great course to end on. That concludes the final wave. Well, almost. As part of the final update, they included a music player. At this point, they're doing everything except releasing an official soundtrack. It's the thought that counts though. As for the cups, they were pretty good. Once again, the tour courses were probably the lowest point, but even the lows weren't too bad. In fact, I enjoyed these courses more than I expected. It's not quite as good as Wave 3 in my opinion, but I enjoyed it more than both Wave 5 and probably even 4. So how would I judge the Booster Course Pass as a whole? I'm conflicted, because outside of a couple exceptions, the quality never consistently reached that of the base game. The first 2 waves were easily the worst, before the quality peaked with Wave 3, at least in my opinion. They stumbled a bit with Wave 5 especially, but finished strong. You're getting 48 tracks and 8 characters, so it's a little hard to complain. But I don't think that's the proper note to end on. I can see when this team put the effort in. Oh yeah, I didn't even mention this, but along the way, they released several patches that fixed a bunch of minor issues. I really appreciate it when developers do that. The fact that 6 years after Deluxe came out, they were making quality of life updates on the side, both big and small, showed that they cared. If they had more time and didn't have to port over so many mediocre city courses, I think we'd be talking about one of the best DLCs Nintendo's ever released. As it is now, this is more than enough to tide me over till the next full game. And even then, the Booster Course Pass is important for preserving the work they did for Tour before that app shuts down. Well, except for Piranha Plant Pipeline, I guess. So I think we can all agree that on some level, the DLC is one of the better things Nintendo's done with the Mario Kart series. Like I said at the beginning, criticizing this DLC for the past 50 plus minutes was just my way of saying I care. Maybe I do have issues. Until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.